truth behind the abandoned twins, a mother's untold story. Before we begin, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. If you believe the truth always comes out, like and subscribe. Now sit back and enjoy the story. The night was cold, unrelenting in its cruelty. In 1983, beneath a sky where the moon hung like a pale, watchful eye, a young woman ran through the deserted streets of Willow Creek. Her silhouette darted between flickering lamplights, her steps uneven as if each one carried the weight of an unbearable secret. Clutched tightly to her chest was a bundle wrapped in faded blue and white blankets. Two tiny lives nestled together, their soft breaths barely audible over the crunch of gravel beneath her frantic feet. Her face remained hidden, obscured by shadows that seemed almost protective, as though they understood the gravity of what she was about to do. She stopped at the base of St. Mary's Church, its Gothic spires reaching toward the heavens like silent sentinels. For a moment she hesitated, staring down at the precious cargo in her arms. Tears streamed down her cheeks, catching the dim light before falling onto the worn fabric of the blanket. With a final sob, she bent low, placing the bundle gently on the church steps before stepping back into the darkness. An elderly woman sits alone at her kitchen table, bathed in the soft glow of an overhead lamp. The room is quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, a steady reminder of time marching forward without mercy. Spread out before her is an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and creased from years of being folded and unfolded. The headline screams in bold black letters, "Who left these babies?" Below it, a grainy photograph shows two newborns swaddled together, their faces peaceful despite the chaos surrounding their arrival into the world. Her hands tremble as she traces the edge of the clipping with trembling fingers. Her eyes are fixed on the image, but her mind is far away, lost in memories she has tried so hard to bury. Her lips part slightly and she whispers, barely audible, "They've found me." For decades she had lived with the guilt, the shame, the unanswered questions. Who were those babies? What became of them? Did they grow up happy, or did they carry the scars of abandonment like invisible chains? And now, after all these years, someone or something had unearthed the past she thought was buried forever. She leans back in her chair, closing her eyes as the weight of it all threatens to overwhelm her. But there's no escaping this reckoning, not anymore, because outside, beyond the comforting confines of her small home, headlights sweep across the windows. A car door slams shut, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching her front door. Her heart pounds in her chest as she grips the edge of the table. Whoever is coming knows. They know everything. Willow Creek hadn't changed much in 40 years. Its quaint streets still wound lazily through rows of maple trees. Its residents still gathered at the same coffee shop on Main Street to gossip over pie and weak coffee. But lately, whispers had begun to ripple through the town once more. Whispers about two lives left behind long ago. It started innocently enough. Ethan Miller, a gruff contractor with calloused hands and a guarded demeanor, received an email from a genealogy company he'd forgotten he'd signed up for. The message was brief but life-altering. "You have a biological sibling match." At first, Ethan dismissed it as some kind of scam. He didn't need anyone else in his life. He'd built walls high enough to keep the world out. But curiosity gnawed at him until he couldn't ignore it any longer. When Ethan reached out to Emily Carter, a soft-spoken librarian living 3 states away, the pieces began falling into place. They shared memories of growing up separately, adopted by different families who never spoke of their origins beyond vague assurances that they were chosen. Yet now DNA tests confirmed what neither of them could deny. They were siblings, twins even, born together, abandoned together. As news of their discovery spread, so did speculation. Who was their mother? Why had she left them on the steps of St. Mary's Church? And why, after all these years, had fate brought them back to Willow Creek? The town buzzed with theories. Some said the mother must have been young and desperate, unable to care for children. Others whispered darker tales of scandal or abuse. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The past wasn't done haunting Willow Creek, or the twins. Ethan and Emily stood side by side outside St. Mary's Church, staring up at its weathered stone facade. It felt surreal to be standing where their story had begun, though neither of them voiced it aloud. "We should start here," Emily said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She held a notebook filled with scribbled notes and clippings from old newspapers. Her approach was methodical, almost academic, driven by a quiet determination to understand, not just for herself, but for Ethan too. Ethan crossed his arms, scowling. "This is pointless," he muttered. "Even if we find her, what then? She gave us up. End of story." "But don't you want to know why?" Emily pressed gently. "Don't you want answers?" Ethan didn't respond. Truthfully, he did, but not because he cared about forgiveness or closure. No, Ethan wanted justice. Someone owed him an explanation for the emptiness he'd carried his entire life, and he wasn't going to rest until he found it. Their investigation led them to several dead ends, retired nurses who remembered the night vividly but knew nothing of the mother's identity, church records destroyed in a flood decades earlier, and townsfolk eager to share half-remembered rumors. But one name kept surfacing: Maggie Harper. Maggie was a recluse who lived on the outskirts of Willow Creek, tending to a small garden and rarely venturing into town. People described her as kind but distant, someone who seemed burdened by secrets she refused to share. When Ethan and Emily learned that Maggie had been working multiple jobs in 1983 and that she'd abruptly disappeared from public view shortly thereafter, they knew they had to confront her. Through fragmented flashbacks, readers catch glimpses of Maggie's past, a tapestry woven with threads of love, loss, and impossible choices. In one scene, a younger Maggie sits at a cramped kitchen table, cradling a baby while another sleeps in a makeshift bassinet beside her. Her face is gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Bills pile up on the counter unpaid. On the couch lies her frail father, coughing violently as she rushes to his side. "I can't do this alone," she whispers to no one, tears streaming down her cheeks. Another flashback shows Maggie arguing with a man, her boss at the diner where she works late nights. "You can't keep skipping shifts," he barks. "If you can't handle it, maybe this job isn't for you." Maggie bites her lip, humiliation burning in her chest. She glances toward the parking lot, where her car sits idling, 2 car seats buckled in the back seat. Yet another memory reveals Maggie sitting in a dimly lit hospital waiting room, clutching a pregnancy test. Her hand trembles as she stares at the result. Outside, snow falls softly, muffling the sounds of the world beyond. These scenes paint a picture of a woman pushed to her limits, forced to make decisions no mother should ever face. But are these flashes of Maggie's life proof of her guilt, or evidence of something else entirely? As Ethan and Emily close in on the truth, questions linger. Is Maggie truly their mother, or is she merely another victim of circumstances beyond her control? And if she is their mother, what will they say when they finally come face to face with the woman who left them behind? 40 years had passed since that fateful night on the steps of St. Mary's Church. But Willow Creek was a town built on memories and secrets. News traveled fast here, especially when it involved something as shocking as the reappearance of the abandoned twins. When Ethan and Emily's story broke, courtesy of an offhand comment made by Emily to a well-meaning coworker, the whispers began anew. At first, it was just idle chatter over coffee cups and grocery aisles. "Did you hear? They found each other," someone would say, lowering their voice conspiratorially. "Imagine growing up not knowing." But soon the gossip grew darker, more pointed. Speculation about their mother became the talk of the town. Was she still alive? Had she lived in Willow Creek all along, watching them grow up from afar? Or had she fled, unable to face what she'd done? For Ethan and Emily, the renewed attention was suffocating. While Emily tried to deflect questions with polite smiles and vague answers, Ethan bristled at every sideways glance. He didn't trust anyone. Not the nosy neighbors, not the reporters sniffing around for a juicy human interest piece, and certainly not the strangers claiming they might have known your mother back in the day. What unnerved them most, though, was the timing. Why now, after decades of silence, why had fate, or science, decided to bring their past crashing into the present? It wasn't long before theories started swirling like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. Some believed the mother must have been young and desperate, perhaps fleeing an abusive relationship or too poor to care for two infants. Others hinted at scandal, a married woman who couldn't risk exposing her affair, or a teenage girl shamed by her family. One name kept surfacing amid the rumors: Maggie Harper. Maggie was a fixture in Willow Creek lore, though few people actually knew her. She'd always kept to herself, living quietly in a modest house surrounded by wildflowers and overgrown hedges. Over the years, she'd become something of a ghost, a presence felt but rarely seen. But those who remembered 1983 recalled how Maggie had seemed different back then, haunted almost. She worked herself to the bone, one elderly neighbor told Emily during a chance encounter at the post office, always running between jobs, taking care of her daddy till he passed. Then poof, she just disappeared for a while, came back quieter than ever. Emily jotted down the details in her notebook, her pulse quickening. Could Maggie be connected to their past? And if so, how? Meanwhile, Ethan remained skeptical. People love drama, he grumbled one evening as they pored over old documents and newspaper clippings spread across Emily's dining table. Just because some old lady acted weird doesn't mean she's our mom. Maybe not, Emily replied softly, but we won't know unless we ask. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of unanswered questions pressed heavier on both siblings. For Emily, it was a longing for closure, a chance to understand the circumstances that shaped their lives. For Ethan, it was anger, simmery people. Ethan and Emily were an unlikely pair, two halves of a whole torn apart at birth and shaped by vastly different lives. Yet now, bound together by blood and circumstance, they found themselves united in purpose. Each carried their own scars from the past. But while those wounds had hardened Ethan, they seemed to soften Emily, making her more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Ethan was a man of action, his emotions buried beneath layers of grit and cynicism. Growing up in foster care after being adopted by a family that couldn't or wouldn't keep him, he'd learned early on not to rely on anyone. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. So when DNA results confirmed Emily was his twin sister, Ethan's first instinct wasn't joy or relief. It was suspicion. This changes nothing, he said flatly during one of their initial phone calls. We're strangers. Just because we share DNA doesn't mean we owe each other anything. But Emily, who had grown up with loving adoptive parents but always felt like something was missing, refused to let him shut her out. Her voice softened as she replied, I'm not asking for anything, Ethan. I need answers, don't you? Reluctantly, Ethan agreed to meet her in person. Together they began piecing together fragments of their shared history, starting with the night they were abandoned. They visited St. Mary's Church, combed through old newspaper archives, and interviewed anyone willing to talk. What they uncovered painted a picture of a town caught between compassion and judgment, a place where whispers could ruin lives. Their search eventually led them to Maggie Harper. Maggie's name surfaced repeatedly, though no one could say definitively why. Some mentioned her kindness, others spoke of her reclusiveness. One elderly woman recalled seeing Maggie working double shifts at the diner around the time of the twins' abandonment. Another remembered hearing rumors about Maggie struggling to care for her ailing father while juggling multiple jobs. She used to come into my store sometimes, said Mr. Callahan, the owner of a hardware shop on Main Street. He leaned against the counter, scratching his chin thoughtfully. Always polite, always quiet. But there was something sad about her, even before whatever happened. Before what? Ethan pressed, his tone sharp. Mr. Callahan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Look, I don't know anything for sure, but people talked, said she disappeared for a few months back in '83. When she came back, she wasn't the same. Emily exchanged a glance with Ethan. This was the first real lead they'd found. Armed with this new information, they decided to pay Maggie a visit. Her house sat on the outskirts of Willow Creek, tucked away behind a grove of towering oak trees. The property was overgrown, wildflowers spilling onto the cracked driveway. A weathered for sale sign leaned crookedly near the gate, its paint faded from years of sun and rain. As they approached the front door, Ethan's jaw tightened. If she is our mother, he muttered under his breath, She better have a damn good reason for leaving us. Emily placed a calming hand on his arm. Let's just hear her out, okay? No matter what, we deserve to know the truth. When Maggie opened the door, she looked smaller than either of them expected, frail with silver hair pulled back into a loose bun and eyes clouded by age. For a moment, she simply stared at them, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Photographs lined the walls, capturing moments frozen in time. A young Maggie smiling beside her father, snapshots of birthday parties and holidays long past. But there were gaps too, empty spaces where frames should have been. "I've been expecting you," Maggie said finally, her voice trembling slightly. She motioned for them to sit, then lowered herself into a chair across from them. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Why? Why now?" Maggie sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the oak trees, casting shadows that danced across the floor. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of decades. "It's not easy," she began softly, "to live with the choices I made. But if you're here, then it means the truth has finally caught up with me." As Maggie sat across from Ethan and Emily, her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Her eyes darted between them, searching for something: recognition, forgiveness, or perhaps just a glimmer of understanding. But before she could speak further, fragmented memories began to surface, not only in her mind but also through glimpses shared with the reader. It was late 1982, and Maggie Harper was barely holding on. At 24 years old, she worked 3 jobs: mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning houses, and evenings shelving books at the library. Her father, frail and bedridden after a stroke, depended on her entirely. "Maggie," he rasped one night as she tucked a blanket around his thin frame, "you shouldn't have to do all this alone." "I'm fine, Daddy," she lied, forcing a smile. "Go back to sleep." But she wasn't fine. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, and bills piled up faster than she could pay them. Still, she pressed on, determined to keep their small home and give her father some semblance of dignity in his final days. What no one knew, not even her closest friends, was that Maggie had another secret weighing heavily on her heart. She'd been seeing someone briefly, a man whose promises turned out to be hollow. When he disappeared without explanation months earlier, Maggie realized too late why. She was pregnant. At first, denial kept her going. Maybe it wasn't true. Maybe she was just stressed, overworked. But when the pregnancy test confirmed what she feared most, panic set in. How could she possibly care for a child, or worse, 2, when she could barely take care of herself and her father? By spring of 1983, Maggie's world felt like it was crumbling. Her father's health continued to decline, requiring expensive medications she couldn't afford. The diner cut her hours due to slow business, leaving her scrambling to make ends meet. And then there were the twins growing inside her, each kick a reminder of the impossible choice looming ahead. One evening, after another exhausting day, Maggie collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who often helped by bringing over meals, found her there. "Maggie, sweetheart, you can't keep doing this to yourself," Mrs. Peterson said gently. "You're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I don't have a choice," Maggie whispered brokenly. "If I stop, if I fail—" She couldn't finish the thought. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "There are places that can help women in your situation. Adoption agencies, support groups." Maggie shook her head violently. "I won't give them up. Not yet." Yet deep down, doubt gnawed at her resolve. Could she really provide the life these children deserved? Or would keeping them mean sacrificing everything, including her father's care? The memory came unbidden now, vivid and haunting. It was November, bitterly cold, and Maggie had just returned home from the hospital where her father had passed away hours earlier. Grief overwhelmed her, compounded by the reality that she was completely alone. In the corner of her tiny living room lay the bassinet she'd scavenged from a thrift store, still wrapped in plastic. 2 onesies hung neatly folded nearby, gifts from Mrs. Peterson. For weeks, Maggie had convinced herself she could do this, that somehow she'd find a way. But staring at those preparations now, she felt only despair. Who was she kidding? She couldn't even afford formula, let alone diapers or clothes. Every option felt like a dead end. That night, under the cover of darkness, Maggie made the hardest decision of her life. Wrapping the newborn twins in faded blankets, she kissed their foreheads one last time and carried them to St. Mary's Church. As she placed them gently on the steps, tears streamed down her face, freezing against the chill of the air. "I'm so sorry," she whispered before disappearing into the shadows. Back in the present, Maggie finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to leave you, but I truly believed, it was the best thing I could do for you, to give you a chance at a better life." Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Emily, however, reached out tentatively, her own eyes glistening with tears. Was it really that bad?" Maggie nodded, guilt etched into every line of her face. "I didn't know how to fix things. I was drowning, and I thought letting you go would save you." For a moment, silence filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, echoing the restless uncertainty swirling within Ethan and Emily. Was this woman truly their mother? Or was she merely another piece of the puzzle, someone caught in the crossfire of fate? And if she was their mother, how could they reconcile the love they longed for with the abandonment they'd endured? It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Ethan and Emily had planned to approach Maggie again, to give her another chance to explain herself in a calm, controlled setting. But when they saw her walking toward St. Mary's Church one evening, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of streetlights, they couldn't wait. Something about the scene felt hauntingly familiar, as though history were repeating itself right before their eyes. "Is that—" Emily trailed off, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she parked the car across from the church. Her heart raced with a mix of dread and anticipation. Ethan didn't answer. He was already out of the car, his long strides carrying him quickly toward the steps where their story had begun 40 years ago. Emily hurried after him, calling his name softly, but he ignored her. This was it, the moment they'd been chasing for weeks. Maggie stood frozen on the very spot where the twins had been left decades earlier. In her hands, she clutched an old photograph, its edges worn and frayed. The moonlight illuminated her face, revealing tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She looked smaller than ever, almost fragile, as if the weight of her secrets might finally crush her. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. His sudden appearance startled Maggie, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping the photo. Emily stepped forward, her tone gentler but firm. "We need answers, Maggie. Please, who are those babies in the picture? Are they us?" Maggie hesitated, her gaze darting between them. For a brief moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. A mixture of guilt, sorrow, and something else neither sibling could quite place. Was it fear, regret, or simply the overwhelming burden of being caught? I can't," Maggie stammered, clutching the photograph closer to her chest. "You don't understand." "Then help us understand," Ethan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You owe us that much." Maggie flinched at his words, her shoulders sagging under the weight of their judgment. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I did what I thought was best." "Best for who?" Ethan shot back, taking a step closer. "For you, because it sure as hell wasn't best for us." Before Maggie could respond, Emily interjected, trying to diffuse the tension. "Please, just tell us the truth. Why did you leave us here? What happened to you?" Maggie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head violently. Without warning, she turned and bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as she had all those years ago. "Wait!" Emily called after her, instinctively starting to chase. But Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Let her go," he said bitterly, his jaw clenched. "She's not going to talk. Not tonight." Emily wrenched her arm free, glaring at him. "And what happens next, Ethan? We just let her run away again? That's not closure. That's more questions." He didn't respond. his gaze fixed on the empty space where Maggie had stood moments earlier. The photograph she'd been holding lay forgotten on the ground, fluttering slightly in the cool breeze. Emily bent down to pick it up, her breath catching as she realized what it was. A grainy black and white image of two newborns swaddled together, taken on the very night they were abandoned. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were three words that sent chills down her spine. Forgive me, please. Back at Emily's house later that night, the atmosphere was thick with unresolved emotions. Ethan paced the living room like a caged animal, while Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph in silence. Neither of them knew how to process what had just happened, or how to move forward. We should have followed her, Ethan muttered finally, breaking the tense quiet. She knows something, and we let her slip through our fingers. And then what? Emily countered, her voice tinged with exasperation. Drag it out of her? Force her to confess? You saw how broken she looked, Ethan. Whatever she's hiding, it's tearing her apart. That doesn't excuse what she did, Ethan snapped. She left us here. She walked away. End of story. It's not that simple, Emily shot back, slamming her hand on the table. Don't you want to know why? Don't you care about the truth? Of course I do, Ethan shouted, spinning around to face her. But hearing excuses isn't going to change anything. It won't fix my life or yours. All it'll do is dredge up more pain. Emily fell silent, her anger giving way to sadness. She glanced back at the photograph, tracing the faint outlines of the babies' faces with her fingertip. Maybe it won't fix everything, she said quietly, but maybe knowing the truth will help us heal. Isn't that worth fighting for? Ethan didn't answer. He turned away, his expression unreadable, and stared out the window into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Maggie Harper was still running. From them, from the past, from herself. And until they found her, the truth would remain just out of reach. Maggie's house felt eerily quiet as Ethan and Emily stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by decades of dust on the hardwood floors. They hadn't planned to break in, not exactly, but desperation had driven them here. After Maggie fled into the night at St. Mary's Church, they realized she wasn't going to offer answers willingly. If they wanted the truth, they'd have to find it themselves. This doesn't feel right, Emily whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward the front door. Her conscience tugged at her, but curiosity and a deep-seated need for closure kept her moving forward. It's not breaking in if we're looking for something that belongs to us, Ethan retorted, his tone clipped. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a faded trunk tucked beneath a crocheted blanket in the corner. Start there. Emily hesitated, then knelt beside the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside, layers of memories lay buried under years of neglect. Yellowed letters tied with fraying ribbon, brittle hospital forms, and small treasures wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, mingling with the musty smell of age. The first letter was addressed to someone named Sister Catherine, dated early 1983. Written in neat cursive, Maggie's words painted a portrait of a woman teetering on the edge of despair. Dear Sister Catherine, I don't know where else to turn. My father's dying, and I'm struggling to keep everything together. There are days when I can barely breathe, let alone think about tomorrow. I'm scared, not just for myself, but for my babies. What kind of life can I give them? Please, if you know anyone who might help. The letter ended abruptly, unfinished, as though Maggie had been interrupted or overcome with emotion. Emily swallowed hard, passing it to Ethan without a word. His expression remained stony, but his hands trembled slightly as he read. Beneath the letters were medical records from Willow Creek General Hospital. One document caught Emily's eye. A discharge summary dated November 14th, 1983. It listed Maggie Harper as the patient and noted complications during childbirth. In the margin, someone had scribbled, "Twins delivered healthy. Mother requests no contact." Ethan frowned, flipping through the pages. So she was pregnant with twins. That matches what we know. But why would she sign off on no contact unless... His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken implications. Emily nodded silently, piecing the puzzle together in her mind. Every clue pointed to Maggie being their mother, yet none provided definitive proof. It was as if she'd deliberately erased herself from their lives, leaving only fragments behind. At the bottom of the trunk, Emily found a bundle wrapped in faded blue fabric. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed sketches of baby booties, tiny, delicate designs drawn with painstaking precision. Some were labeled with measurements and notes. 2 pairs, wool blend, or add lace trim. Beneath the sketches lay scraps of fabric, remnants of projects never completed. "These aren't just doodles," Emily murmured, holding one up to the light. "She planned this. She cared enough to try." Ethan crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "Cared enough to abandon us, you mean?" "No," Emily countered sharply, standing to face him. "Don't do that. Don't twist this into something ugly before we even understand it. These clues, they tell a story. A hard one, yes, but maybe not the one you want to believe." "What other story is there?" Ethan shot back. "She left us. End of story." As they continued searching, Emily noticed a small wooden box tucked beneath a stack of old magazines. Inside, she found a locket engraved with a single word: forever. Opening it revealed 2 tiny photographs, one of a newborn baby swaddled in a faded blanket, the other of an older man who bore a striking resemblance to Maggie. On the back of the locket, etched so faintly it was almost invisible, were initials: E, H, and EM. Ethan stared at the locket, his breath catching. "Those are our initials," he said hoarsely. "How could she—" Emily took the locket gently, her heart pounding. For the first time, doubt flickered across Ethan's face, softening the anger that had defined him for so long. "She kept this," Emily whispered. "Even after everything, she kept a piece of us." By the time they left Maggie's house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Each clue they'd uncovered painted a picture of sacrifice and survival, but still, no definitive answer. Was Maggie truly their mother? Or was she merely a woman haunted by her own choices, carrying guilt for someone else's actions? As they drove back to Emily's house in silence, both siblings wrestled with conflicting emotions. Ethan clutched the locket tightly in his hand, its weight heavier than he'd expected. Emily gazed out the window, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Somewhere out there, Maggie Harper was hiding. From them, from the past, perhaps even from herself. And until they confronted her again, the truth would remain shrouded in mystery. For days after their confrontation at St. Mary's Church, Maggie avoided leaving her house. She'd always been a recluse, but now she felt like a prisoner in her own life. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door sent her heart racing. She knew it was only a matter of time before Ethan and Emily found her again. And this time, they wouldn't let her run. She couldn't blame them. If their roles were reversed, she would have done the same thing. But facing them meant confronting the ghosts of her past, the choices she'd made, the lives she'd altered irreparably. For 40 years, she'd carried that weight alone. Could she bear to share it with anyone else? Then one morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, Maggie came to a decision. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. The truth had already begun seeping out, piece by painful piece. It was time to face it head on, to tell her story, no matter how much it hurt. When Ethan and Emily arrived at Maggie's house later that week, the air was thick with tension. They debated whether coming back was the right move, but something about the locket and the vulnerability in Maggie's eyes when they last saw her had convinced them to give her one more chance. Maggie greeted them at the door, her expression calm but weary. She gestured for them to sit in the living room, where faded photographs still lined the walls, and the faint scent of lavender lingered. Instead of sitting across from them, she perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands clasped tightly together. "I owe you both the truth," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "And I'll understand if you hate me for it." Ethan leaned forward, his arms crossed defensively. "Just start talking." Emily reached over and placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently urging him to listen. Maggie took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "It started long before you two were born," Maggie said softly, her gaze drifting toward the window. "I was 24, working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my father's head. He was sick, so sick, and I didn't know how to save him. When I found out I was pregnant, she paused, swallowing hard. It felt like the world was ending. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed intently on Maggie. At first, I thought I could do it all. Work, take care of Daddy, raise you both. But then reality hit. I couldn't afford diapers or formula, let alone childcare. And when Daddy passed away, her voice cracked, tears welling up in her eyes. I was completely alone, completely broke. I thought about adoption agencies, support groups, anything to help me figure it out. But every option felt wrong, like I'd be giving up, not just on myself, but on you. So instead, you left us on a church step? Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp. Maggie flinched but nodded. Yes, but not because I didn't love you, because I loved you too much to keep you in a life that was falling apart. I truly believed that someone better could take care of you, someone who could give you everything I couldn't. Maggie pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, dabbing at her eyes. Every day since that night, I've wondered if I made the right decision, wondered if you grew up happy, safe, loved. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you. She stood abruptly, crossing the room to retrieve the locket Ethan had discovered in her trunk. Holding it gently, she opened it to reveal the tiny photographs inside. These are you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your first pictures. I kept them close, even though I told myself I should forget. I couldn't. Not entirely. Emily's breath hitched as she looked at the locket, her vision blurring with tears. Why didn't you try to find us? She asked, her voice trembling. Because I didn't deserve to, Maggie replied honestly. You deserved parents who could give you stability, security, not a scared, broken girl who couldn't even feed herself. Decades of regret. Maggie sank back into her chair, exhausted by the weight of her confession. I've spent 40 years punishing myself for what I did, moving away, cutting ties with everyone I knew. It was easier than facing the truth, easier than wondering if you hated me. And now here you are, demanding answers I don't know how to give. Her gaze shifted between them, searching for any sign of forgiveness or understanding. I can't change the past. Believe me, I've tried. All I can do is tell you why I did what I did and hope someday you'll see that it wasn't about abandonment. It was about love. The room fell silent as Maggie's words hung heavy in the air. Ethan stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tightly. Emily wiped at her tears, clutching the locket like a lifeline. Neither sibling spoke immediately. The emotions swirling within them were too raw, too complex to articulate. Finally, Emily broke the silence. It doesn't make it okay, she said softly. What you did, it hurt us. It shaped our whole lives. But I think I understand now, at least a little. Ethan shot her a look, clearly conflicted. Understanding doesn't fix anything, he muttered bitterly. No, Maggie agreed, her voice filled with sorrow. It doesn't, but maybe it's a start. Days passed after Maggie's confession, each one heavy with unspoken thoughts and unresolved emotions. Ethan withdrew into himself, retreating to his workshop, a small shed behind Emily's house, where he spent hours sanding wood and pounding nails, as though trying to hammer away the turmoil inside him. Emily, on the other hand, found solace in writing letters she never intended to send, pouring her heart onto paper in an effort to process everything they'd learned. But despite their different ways of coping, neither sibling could escape the truth that had been laid bare before them. It lingered in every quiet moment, every shared glance, every sleepless night. And while Emily seemed to soften toward Maggie, Ethan remained stubbornly closed off, unwilling or unable to let go of the anger that had defined him for so long. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky erupted into a tapestry of stars, Ethan stepped outside. He hadn't planned to. It was just something about the stillness of the night that called to him. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from Maggie's overgrown yard next door. Without thinking, he wandered toward the edge of Emily's property, settling onto a weathered bench beneath an ancient oak tree. For a while, he simply sat there, staring up at the heavens. The stars stretched endlessly above him, vast and untouchable, just like the questions swirling in his mind. How could he reconcile the pain of abandonment with the love Maggie claimed to feel? How could he forgive someone who had left him when he needed her most? And yet, something about her vulnerability haunted him. The way she looked at them, not with defiance or excuses, but with raw, unfiltered honesty. She hadn't tried to justify what she'd done. Instead, she'd bared her soul, exposing the cracks in her own armor. That kind of courage was unfamiliar to Ethan. All his life, he'd built walls to protect himself from being hurt again. But seeing Maggie, the woman who had once carried him in her arms, so openly broken, made him question whether those walls were really protecting him or keeping him trapped. As Ethan wrestled with these thoughts, Emily appeared silently beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. She didn't say anything at first, simply sitting down and following his gaze toward the stars. For several minutes they sat together in companionable silence, the bond between them stronger than words. Finally Ethan spoke, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "Do you think she meant it? What she said about loving us?" Emily turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "I do," she replied softly. "It doesn't make what she did okay, but I believe she thought she was doing the right thing. In her own messed up way, she loved us enough to let us go." Ethan clenched his fists, struggling to articulate the storm raging within him. "That's the part I don't get. How can leaving us be an act of love? Love is supposed to mean staying, fighting for us, not walking away." "I used to think that too," Emily admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "But now, I wonder if love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go, giving someone a chance at a better life, even if it means sacrificing your own happiness." Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan, resonating with memories he'd buried long ago. Growing up in foster care, he'd convinced himself that no one would ever truly fight for him, so he stopped expecting it, stopped trusting anyone who tried. He built walls not just to keep people out, but to shield himself from the pain of hoping they might stay. But now, staring up at the infinite expanse of stars, he realized something. Maggie had fought for him, not in the way he'd wanted or expected, but in the only way she knew how. By letting him go, she'd given him a chance at a life she couldn't provide. And maybe, just maybe, that was its own kind of love. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, blurring the constellations above him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his pain and the possibility of forgiveness. His voice cracked as he whispered, "What if I've been wrong all this time? What if I've been punishing myself for something I didn't even understand?" Emily reached over, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to change, Ethan, to forgive her and yourself. You've spent your whole life running from the idea of abandonment, but maybe it's time to stop running and start healing." Ethan nodded slowly, the walls he'd spent decades building beginning to crumble. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he wasn't ready to fully embrace Maggie as his mother. But for the first time, he understood that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about finding peace. In the days following Ethan's breakthrough under the stars, a fragile sense of hope began to take root within their fractured family. Though forgiveness wasn't instantaneous, and trust would take time to rebuild, the seeds had been planted. Emily, ever the bridge builder, decided it was time to nurture those seeds in a way that felt both personal and meaningful. One afternoon, while sorting through more of Maggie's belongings, Emily stumbled upon an old sketchbook tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. Its pages were filled with vibrant drawings, landscapes, still lifes, and whimsical scenes of children playing beneath sun-dappled trees. But what caught her attention most were the unfinished sketches of two infants swaddled together, surrounded by delicate flowers and tiny stars. "Did you used to paint?" Emily asked softly, holding up the sketchbook as she joined Maggie in the kitchen. Maggie glanced over, her expression softening at the sight of the familiar book. "I did," she admitted, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Back when I had the energy for dreams." She chuckled bitterly, shaking her head. "But after everything, I stopped. It didn't feel right anymore." Emily studied her carefully, an idea forming in her mind. What if you started again? Not because you have to, but because it might help. For all of us. Maggie frowned, unsure of what Emily meant. Help how? Well, Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Art has always been my way of processing things. When life gets overwhelming, I write or draw. It helps me make sense of the chaos. And seeing your sketches? They're beautiful, Maggie, full of love and light. Maybe painting could be your way of healing too. For a moment, Maggie said nothing, her gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight filtered through the overgrown garden outside. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Maybe you're right, she murmured. It couldn't hurt to try. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Maggie worked side by side on a project that quickly became more than just art. It became a symbol of their journey toward reconciliation. They chose the side of Maggie's barn as their canvas, its weathered wood serving as a blank slate for their shared story. Armed with brushes, paints, and determination, they began transforming the space into something breathtaking. At first, Maggie hesitated, her strokes tentative and unsure. But as Emily encouraged her, reminding her to let go of perfection and simply create from the heart, Maggie's confidence grew. Together, they painted three figures standing beneath a starry sky, their hands linked in unity. The two smaller figures represented Ethan and Emily, while the taller one stood between them, a mother guiding, protecting, and loving from afar. Around the central image, they added intricate details, wildflowers spilling across the foreground, constellations twinkling above, and faint outlines of baby booties hidden among the brushstrokes. Each element carried meaning. Each color told a story. By the time they finished, the mural radiated warmth and resilience, a testament to the power of love, sacrifice, and second chances. On the day they completed the mural, Ethan surprised them both by showing up unexpectedly. He'd been distant since his emotional moment under the stars, retreating into himself as he processed everything. But when he saw the vibrant artwork stretching across the barn, something shifted inside him. "What is this?" he asked gruffly, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "It's our story," Emily explained, smiling warmly. "Or at least part of it. Maggie and I wanted to create something that showed we're moving forward, together." Ethan stepped closer, studying the mural intently. His eyes lingered on the figure in the middle, the mother who had once walked away, but was now trying to stay. Slowly he reached out, tracing the outline of the connected hands with his fingertips. "It's nice," he said finally, his voice softer than before. Turning to Maggie, he added, "You're really good at this." Maggie blinked back tears, touched by his rare compliment. "Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot." For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to smile, a small, hesitant gesture, but genuine nonetheless. As he stood there beside his sister and the woman who had given them life, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. The mural quickly became a landmark in Willow Creek, drawing curious visitors and sparking conversations about forgiveness, redemption, and the ties that bind us. For Maggie, Ethan, and Emily, however, it was more than just a piece of art. It was proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, patience, and love. Though their journey was far from over, they had taken the first steps toward rebuilding what had been broken. And as they stood together beneath the starry sky one evening, admiring the mural they had created, they knew one thing for certain. No matter how far apart they had been, they were finally home. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as Maggie stepped onto her porch, wrapping a knitted shawl tightly around her shoulders. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the yard where laughter echoed, a sound that had been absent from this place for far too long. In the distance, Ethan crouched beside his young son, showing him how to grip a football just right. "Like this," he said, his voice firm but patient. "Now throw it straight ahead." The boy giggled, fumbling the ball before launching it awkwardly into the air. Ethan caught it with ease, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. Nearby, Emily sat on a quilt spread over the grass, cradling her newborn daughter in her arms. Her soft laughter mingled with the rustle of leaves as she teased Ethan about his coaching skills, or lack thereof. You're supposed to be teaching him, not embarrassing yourself, she called out playfully. Maggie watched them silently, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't dared to feel in decades. Peace, joy, regret, gratitude. They all swirled together, forming a bittersweet tapestry of everything she'd lost and found again. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. These were tears of redemption, of love enduring against all odds. Love doesn't disappear when we lose our way. It stays quiet and steadfast, even when we can't see it anymore. Sometimes it just waits patiently for us to find each other again. As she spoke these words, softly almost to herself, they seemed to hang in the air like whispers carried by the wind. She thought back to the choices she'd made, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering if she'd done the right thing. And now, standing here surrounded by the family she once thought she'd lost forever, she finally understood. Her decision hadn't been perfect. It had been human, flawed, painful, but ultimately driven by love. And though forgiveness hadn't come easily, it had come. That was enough, more than enough. Ethan glanced up, catching Maggie's gaze. For a moment their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Not full acceptance, perhaps, but progress. Enough to keep moving forward. Emily noticed the exchange and smiled warmly at Maggie, waving her over. "Come join us," she called, patting the empty spot beside her on the quilt. Maggie hesitated only briefly before descending the porch steps and crossing the yard. As she settled onto the quilt, Emily handed her the baby, who stirred gently in her arms. Maggie looked down at the tiny face, so peaceful and trusting, and felt a wave of emotion crash over her. This was what she'd dreamed of all those years ago, the chance to hold her grandchildren, to witness the lives her children had built despite everything. "I think she likes you," Emily said softly, watching as Maggie rocked the baby instinctively. "She's beautiful," Maggie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." Ethan approached, his son trailing behind him, clutching the football. "Hey, Grandma," the boy chirped shyly, peeking out from behind his father's leg. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear that word directed at her. Not yet, maybe not ever. But there it was, offered freely and without hesitation. "Hey there, champ," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're getting pretty good at throwing that ball." The boy beamed, proud of the compliment, and Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Don't encourage him too much. We've still got work to do." They shared a laugh then, the kind that comes naturally when walls have been broken down and hearts have begun to heal. In that moment, beneath the wide-open sky and amidst the vibrant colors of autumn, Maggie felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 40 years. Hope. As the day wore on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink, Maggie realized that life wasn't about erasing mistakes or rewriting the past. It was about finding beauty in the broken pieces, about learning to forgive, not just others, but yourself. She glanced around at the people who had become her world once more. Ethan, strong and stubborn, yet capable of such tenderness. Emily, compassionate and resilient, always seeking connection. And now the next generation, carrying forward the legacy of love that had endured even in its absence. For the first time in decades, Maggie felt truly whole. And as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight, she whispered softly to the stars above, "Thank you